All right, these are very difficult topics, so very explicit trigger warning that this will get into sensitive topics. Please give the other channel a chance, the Kubrick channel, as well as consider supporting the channel via Patreon and other methods. So the very short version in terms of larger context is Mike Rinder is the former head of OSA. He more recently has become a whistleblower, doing many shows and podcasts, and John is a longtime researcher. He was also in Scientology for many years, but he came out long ago and has been a persistent writer and critic. So they recently had a conversation where they went into many different controversies, the Aftermath Foundation controversy, Miriam Francis, and other controversies. I will assume people know the basics of those controversies.
4,000 people who are being held as slaves today in the Scientology organization under the name of the Sea organization. They are slaves. You understand that better than anybody understands it because of the time that you spent being a slave of Ron Hubbard and later of David Miscavige.
Well, although I think it's fair to call Mike Rinder a victim, and I don't think it's unfair to call people in Scientology being held against their will as slaves, I am a little concerned that John is extending that classification onto Rinder. It's definitely the case that Rinder at a very young age was brainwashed and indoctrinated. However, I'm uncomfortable comparing him to other cases. I think we can call him a servant of Hubbard and later a servant of Miscavige until Miscavige savagely beat him and attacked him. However, those are very different categories. A slave has virtually no rights. Rinder was the head of OSA. He also held many high positions. Granted, he was overworked and have full power, full control, but it's not right to consider him a total slave who had no rights, no powers, no way to leave. He did. I mean, he left eventually. So there are people in the Sea Org as well as Scientology who cannot leave at all. So I want to be careful there that we're mixing different categories. And that gets into the prime issue here of his level of guilt as well as his how much has he helped the victim.
Many years before some of the victims even realize that they were victims, and B, before they are able to even speak about it, and C, let alone go to any authorities and file complaints.
So I want to be careful. I'm trying to be fair here. I'm editing this out because YouTube, again, will penalize if certain words are used. But essentially, John is asking, well, you can't be, quote, hurting child victims if you're on the board of a foundation where you're dedicated to helping those victims. I mean, that is a deep, serious question. Pragmatically, has he helped victims? I think even if you hate Rinder, you have to say, yes, he has helped several victims. But again, even if we assume he's helped these victims, there are other victims, right? Like Jerry Armstrong, like Kyle Brennan, Alonzo, Doug Scott Kramer. We could go through the list. There are other victims. The question is, what did Mike Rinder do in those cases? I think that's where there are difficulties. Even if we can assume good faith, he helped these victims, there are other categories of victims. There are other victims, and Rinder is aware of this. People brought up to him the case of Kyle Brennan. He knows about Alonzo, and so on and so forth. So it's being deceptive to say, well, he helped these victims, and that should end the question. It answers several questions. It does not answer all the questions.
Accepted the award, and then Marcy asked if we would like to be on the board. Leah had too many other commitments. I said, of course, and Bob's your uncle.
Yeah.
I do understand what John is trying to say, that, well, there's good faith here that Rinder did sit on the board, and therefore these accusations don't make sense. Well, that's correct. I mean, again, some of these arguments made against Rinder are nonsensical. That is true. However, we have to be a little bit careful here. As Rinder admits himself, he never intended to do this. Lily was asked, do you want to be on the board? And Lily said, no, I can't do it. I'm committed elsewhere. It's like, okay, fine. I, Mike Rinder, will help. I mean, that says something good about him. He didn't have to do that, but it wasn't intentional. He didn't plan to help these child victims. There is still a rewriting of history, which is Very deceptive. Now, how much is John aware of this deception? That's difficult to know. Probably the most alarming, compromising tie with him is Karen. And Karen is not directly involved with some of these recent controversies, but she is in the background. The conversation was very biased, but was it informative? Yes. And a lot of people, unfortunately, did not listen clearly to the whole conversation, and they're just lying about it. So it's a very flawed conversation, but it was productive. However, I don't think it tackled the central issues or problems. And I will try to go through this and the other commentaries, because this is a long conversation, so it's going to take quite a few videos to work through it. Thank you for listening.